An exciting story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. She only wanted to organize files for 3 weeks, but a tear in her skirt revealed a past she didn't know she carried. He had too much money, too many secrets, and a guilt he chose to hide with sweetness. What begins as help ends with the cruelest question love can ask. Aaron Sullivan was a man nobody really knew. Forbes called him a visionary. Wall Street investors called him ruthless. Those benefiting from the Sullivan Institute's donations saw him as a silent angel who funded free cancer treatments in public hospitals across America. But he saw himself as a survivor, someone who carried the ruins of his own choices on his shoulders under the guise of a philanthropist. At 42, Aaron commanded the largest pharmaceutical company in the country from his office atop a mirrored building on Wall Street in New York. Sullivan Biotech had laboratories scattered from Texas to Massachusetts, and its patents moved sums that made even the most experienced executives lose their breath. Widowed for 3 years, he lived surrounded by reports, silent corridors, and maintained meticulous control over every detail of his life and company. He slept little and trusted even less. The death of Isabella, his wife, in a never fully explained accident involving an experimental compound, had left scars deeper than he dared admit. She died before she could publicly denounce him, and he never knew if this redeemed him or condemned him even more. What remained was the deafening silence of an apartment in Brooklyn that he couldn't sell, but couldn't bear to inhabit either. That's why Aaron lived in his office. Literally. He had transformed a room adjoining the presidential suite into a Spartan bedroom, with a twin bed, a functional bathroom, and a small kitchen where he prepared only black coffee and tasteless sandwiches. It was a self-imposed exile, a silent penance that he religiously fulfilled, as if deprivation could erase what could no longer be fixed. Claire Mitchell was 29 years old, with a history of escapes that didn't appear in any official record. The daughter of a French immigrant who disappeared when she was still a child, she was raised by an aunt in Queens, in a small apartment where the scent of lavender never completely masked the aroma of medicines and sadness. She had gone through 5 jobs in the last 2 years, collected dismissals, and learned early to distrust gestures that came too easily. The rich bored her, the charitable even more. She worked as a private French teacher for executives who wanted to impress European clients, and to supplement her income, accepted small cataloging contracts at historical foundations and research institutes. She was intelligent, ironic, and had greenish-brown eyes that didn't beg but questioned. When she was hired to digitize old documents from the historical archive of the Sullivan Foundation, she expected only silence, dust, and 3 weeks in a dark library in the basement of a commercial building on the Upper East Side. The Sullivan Institute occupied 2 floors of a renovated historic building in central Manhattan, near Lincoln Center. From the outside, it maintained the original facade from the 1920s, with its Art Deco ornaments and large wooden windows painted dark green. Inside, it had been completely modernized, with climate-controlled rooms, state-of-the-art security systems, and an archive that housed more than 50 years of medical research, clinical trial reports, and correspondence documenting the evolution of pharmaceutical medicine in America. Claire arrived on a rainy Monday in March, when New York was immersed in that fine, persistent drizzle that seems to dissolve the city's contours. She wore a white cotton blouse, a navy blue midi skirt, and comfortable flat shoes, the kind of outfit that didn't draw attention but didn't go unnoticed either. Her brown hair was tied in a low bun, and she carried a worn leather bag that had belonged to her mother, the only personal object that remained after her disappearance. The head of the archive, Dr. Henry Sanders, a kind man in his 60s with gold-rimmed glasses and a paternal smile, greeted her at reception and led her to the basement. The marble stairs echoed under their steps, and Claire noticed how the air became denser as they descended, laden with the characteristic smell of old paper and preservation chemicals. "The work is simple, but meticulous," explained Dr. Sanders as he opened the door to a spacious room, lined with shelves that went from floor to ceiling. "We have about 10,000 documents that need to be digitized and catalogued. Letters, research reports, meeting minutes, commercial correspondence, all dated between 1970 and 2010. You'll have access to a professional scanner and a cataloging system that our IT team developed specifically for this project." Claire observed the environment. The shelves were organized chronologically, with discrete labels indicating the periods. There was a work table in the center of the room, equipped with a computer, the scanner, and an LED lamp that projected a white, uniform light. The walls were painted in a neutral beige tone, and the floor was made of light wooden boards, freshly waxed. It was a pleasant, silent space, perfect for the kind of meticulous work she appreciated. "The schedule is flexible," continued Dr. Sanders. "You can work from 8 to 5 or from 10 to 7, as you prefer. We have a cafeteria on the second floor, but many employees prefer to eat at restaurants in the area. The only requirement is that you keep a detailed record of what was digitized each day, so we can track progress." Claire nodded, satisfied with the conditions. The work seemed straightforward, and the solitude of the underground room was exactly what she was looking for. In recent months, she had grown tired of dealing with people, of explaining her unstable professional situation, of justifying her choices. Here, among old documents and the low hum of the air conditioner, she could work in peace. She spent the first 2 days familiarizing herself with the cataloging system and developing an efficient routine. She arrived at 8 in the morning, when the building was still almost empty, and worked in a concentrated way until noon. She took a break to eat at a small Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, walked a little through the streets of downtown to stretch her legs, and returned for 4 more hours of work. The progress was steady, and she began to appreciate the predictability of the routine. The documents told the story of the evolution from a small family pharmacy to a national conglomerate. There were handwritten commercial letters with elegant letterhead and careful calligraphy, research reports typed on old machines with corrections made in pen, black and white photographs of primitive laboratories where men in white coats posed next to equipment that looked rudimentary compared to current standards. It was fascinating to observe how the language had changed over the decades. The reports from the 70s were formal, almost solemn, filled with technical jargon and pompous academic references. In the 80s, the tone became more commercial, focused on results and market strategies. By the 90s, there was a growing concern with ethical issues and government regulations. It was like watching the transformation of a company, but also of an entire society. Claire was cataloguing a set of reports from 1987 when what seemed trivial happened: a stumble. She had stretched to reach a folder on the highest shelf, balancing on her tiptoes when she lost her balance. She tried to support herself on the shelf, but the sudden movement caused some books to fall, and as she tried to prevent them from hitting the floor, she completely lost her balance. She fell sideways, and the fabric of her skirt caught on the sharp edge of the work table, tearing with a sound that echoed through the silent room. Claire remained on the floor for a few seconds, more embarrassed than hurt. The tear in her skirt was large, exposing part of her left thigh, where there was an old whitish scar, the result of a bicycle accident in her teens. She got up quickly, trying to adjust the fabric to cover her leg, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. The door opened, and a man entered the room. Claire immediately recognized him from the photographs she had seen in newspapers and business magazines. Aaron Sullivan. He was taller than he appeared in photos, about 6'1", and had a presence that filled the room even without effort. His hair was dark brown, with some grey strands at the temples, and his eyes were an intense blue, almost electric, which contrasted with his slightly tanned skin. He wore a dark grey suit of impeccable cut, a white shirt without a tie, and brown leather shoes that seemed to be made to measure. Aaron stopped at the entrance, observing the scene, Claire standing next to the table, with books scattered on the floor and the torn fabric of her skirt. His eyes fixed for a moment on the exposed scar on her thigh, but he said nothing about it. He just took off his suit jacket with a fluid movement and extended it to her, keeping his gaze directed to the side as he spoke. "It's easy to get hurt with what wasn't made to be touched," he said with a deep and controlled voice, which carried a slight accent that she couldn't identify. Claire accepted the jacket, still surprised by the unexpected appearance. The fabric was of exceptional quality, soft and heavy, and was impregnated with a discreet masculine perfume, a mixture of sandalwood and something citrusy that she couldn't name. She quickly put it on, covering the tear, and felt strangely protected by the piece that was obviously too expensive for her world. "Thank you," she murmured, trying to maintain her composure. "I was trying to reach that folder and—" "No need to explain," interrupted Aaron, finally facing her. "Accidents happen, especially when working with historical archives. These shelves weren't designed with ergonomics in mind. There was something in the way he observed her that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't an invasive or disrespectful look, but too intense, as if he was trying to decipher something in her. Claire bent down to pick up the books that had fallen, and Aaron approached to help her. When their hands briefly touched as they picked up the same volume, she felt an electric shock that made her instinctively pull back. "Are you okay?" he asked, observing her reaction. "I am," replied Claire faster than she intended. "It was just the shock." Aaron nodded, but continued to observe her with that penetrating gaze. He finished collecting the books and placed them on the table, organizing them in a careful pile. Claire noticed that he wore a simple wristwatch with a brown leather strap, which contrasted with the sophistication of the rest of his appearance. There was something deliberately modest in this detail that intrigued her. "Dr. Sanders told me you're digitizing our historical archive," commented Aaron, breaking the silence that had settled. "Yes," replied Claire. "It's a fascinating job. You have very well-preserved documentation. My mother was meticulous with records. She believed that a company's history should be preserved for future generations, even if not everything is a source of pride." There was something in the way he said this that suggested deeper layers of meaning. Claire observed him more carefully, noting the fine lines around his eyes that indicated chronic fatigue, and the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, as if he carried an invisible weight. "Do you intend to publish this history at some point?" she asked, genuinely curious. Aaron smiled, but it was a smile without joy, more a contraction of the lips than an expression of pleasure. "Maybe. When I have the courage to face what might be found." The answer surprised her with its raw honesty. It was unusual for high-ranking executives to admit vulnerabilities, especially to employees they barely knew. Claire felt that she had stumbled upon something deeper than a simple accident with archive shelves. "Well," said Aaron, checking his watch, "I should let you get back to work. If you need anything, you can talk to Dr. Sanders or call my secretary directly." He headed for the door but stopped before leaving, turning partially to face her once more. "The jacket," said Claire, beginning to take it off. "I should—" "Keep it," interrupted Aaron. "At least until you can fix the skirt, and—" He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue. "If you find anything in the documents that makes you uncomfortable, come to me. Sometimes the past can be more complicated than it seems." With that, he left, leaving Claire alone with a jacket that smelled of mystery and a strange feeling that something fundamental had changed in her tranquil routine. That night, Claire returned to her apartment in Brooklyn with more questions than answers. The jacket was hanging on her chair, and she couldn't stop looking at it. It was an obviously expensive piece, probably Italian, the kind that cost more than she earned in 2 months. But it wasn't the value that bothered her. It was the unexpected intimacy of the gesture, the way Aaron had observed her, and mainly the mysterious warning about the complicated past. She researched him on the internet, reading articles in the New York Times and Time magazine that described his business trajectory. Son of French immigrants who arrived in the United States in the 50s, Aaron had taken control of the family business while still young, after the premature death of his parents in a car accident. He had transformed a small pharmacy into an empire, but had always maintained a discreet profile, avoiding social events and personal interviews. What caught her attention most was an article from 3 years ago, published in the Wall Street Journal, about the death of his wife. Isabella Sullivan, a pediatrician of 40 years, had died after suffering a severe allergic reaction to an experimental medication that was being tested in the company's laboratories. The article mentioned that she was participating as a volunteer in clinical trials of a new anti-inflammatory compound when she developed fatal respiratory complications. The case had been investigated by the FDA, but archived without any irregularities being found in the testing protocols. Claire read and reread the article, feeling a chill in her stomach. There was something in the story that didn't fit perfectly. Why would an experienced doctor participate as a volunteer in tests from her own company? And why had Aaron mentioned that not everything in the company's history was a source of pride? The next morning, she arrived at the archive earlier than usual. She wanted to concentrate on work and forget the speculations that had dominated her thoughts during the night. But when she opened the door to the room, she found a surprise. On her table was a small craft paper box with a handwritten note. "To accompany breakfast. A," said the note, with an elegant, masculine handwriting. Inside the box, there were 2 pastries from a famous French bakery in Brooklyn, still warm, wrapped in parchment paper. Claire smiled involuntarily. It was a simple gesture, but it showed that he had paid enough attention to know that she didn't usually eat breakfast properly. During the following days, the small gestures were repeated. Sometimes it was an espresso in a quality thermos cup, other times a ham and cheese sandwich from a nearby delicatessen, always accompanied by brief and formal notes, signed only with the initial A. Claire began to expect these surprises, although she tried to convince herself that they were just professional courtesies. The conversations also became more frequent. Harren appeared in the archive room 2 or 3 times a week, always with a plausible excuse, checking the progress of the work, asking if she needed additional equipment, commenting on some specific document that might be interesting. But Claire perceived that there was something more behind these visits. The way he observed her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the way he prolonged the conversations with unnecessary questions, the almost palpable tension that was created when they were alone in the room. It was during one of these conversations that she decided to confront him. It was a Friday afternoon, it was raining heavily outside, and the building was practically empty. Aaron had appeared with the excuse of checking if the air conditioning was working properly, but had stayed for almost an hour, leafing through documents and making comments about the evolution of the pharmaceutical industry in America. "Can I ask a question?" said Claire, interrupting an explanation about FDA regulations. "Of course," replied Aaron, closing the folder he was examining. "Why do you come here so frequently?" The question caught him off guard. Claire saw an expression of surprise cross his face, quickly followed by something that could be embarrassment. He began, then stopped. "I think you have the right to an honest answer." "I appreciate honesty," said Claire, crossing her arms and leaning on the table. Aaron walked to the small window that overlooked a ventilation shaft, observing the raindrops that ran down the glass. When he turned to face her again, his expression was more serious, almost vulnerable. "You intrigue me," he said simply. "It's been a long time since I've met someone who makes me question things about myself." "What kind of things?" "If I'm still capable of feeling something beyond guilt and fatigue. If I deserve a second chance to be a better person than I was." The answer completely disarmed her. Claire had expected a corporate explanation, perhaps an admission of superficial romantic interest, but not this raw confession of insecurity and self-recrimination. "And why would I make you question these things?" she asked with a softer voice. "Because you look at me as if I were an interesting puzzle, not as if I were an opportunity or a threat. And because—" he hesitated, running his hand through his hair in a rare demonstration of nervousness. "Because when I'm near you, I can temporarily forget the weight of the things I've done and can't undo." Claire felt her heart accelerate. There was an intensity in his voice that made it impossible to doubt the sincerity. But there was also danger in this honesty, an intimacy that she wasn't prepared to handle. "Aaron," she said, using his name for the first time, "I'm not a therapist, and you don't know me well enough to know if I can help you with anything." "You're right," he admitted. "But that doesn't change the fact that you make me feel more human than I've felt in years." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Claire could feel the attraction between them as a physical force, pulling her in his direction. But she also felt all the alarms of her past experience going off, reminding her that powerful men usually were dangerous for women like her. "I should go," she said, beginning to organize her belongings. "Claire," said Aaron, and the way he pronounced her name made her stop. "I'm not trying to put you in an uncomfortable situation. I need you to know that your presence here means more to me than any cataloging work." She faced him for a long moment, seeing in him not the powerful executive or the mysterious widower, but a man who seemed genuinely lost, looking for a real human connection. It was dangerous and tempting at the same time. "Good night, Aaron," she finally said, picking up her bag. "Good night, Claire," he responded, and remained standing in the middle of the room, observing her leave, with an expression that she took with her during the entire weekend. Monday arrived laden with the kind of humid heat that makes New York seem like a giant greenhouse. Claire woke up earlier than usual, restless with thoughts that had dominated her weekend. Aaron's confession on Friday echoed in her mind, like a melody that she couldn't stop humming. There was a vulnerability in his words that contrasted drastically with the public image of the ruthless businessman, and this left her simultaneously fascinated and apprehensive. She decided to arrive at the archive even earlier, hoping that the familiar solitude of the underground room would help her reorganize her thoughts. But when she descended the marble stairs at 7:15 in the morning, she found the door already unlocked and a soft light emanating from inside. Her heart involuntarily accelerated. Aaron was there, seated in a chair that he had brought from somewhere else, carefully leafing through a file that she didn't recognize. He wore dark jeans and a white polo shirt, a combination that made him seem younger and more accessible than the impeccable suits he usually wore. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had repeatedly run his hands through it, a gesture that Claire was beginning to associate with the moments when he felt less confident. "You're here early," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral as she approached her work table. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, raising his eyes from the document. "I thought maybe I'd find some answers here." "What kind of answers?" Aaron closed the file and carefully placed it on a pile next to his chair. Claire noticed that it was an older folder than the others, with a handwritten label that she couldn't read from the distance where she was. "About how to fix errors that seem irreparable," he said. "About how to forgive yourself when other important people are no longer here to do it for you." The implicit reference to his dead wife hung in the air between them, like an almost tangible presence. Claire felt the impulse to ask directly about Isabella, about the circumstances of her death, about what exactly had happened in the Sullivan laboratories 3 years ago. But something in Aaron's expression stopped her. "Did you find any answers?" she asked, turning on the computer and the scanner. "Some clues," replied Aaron, "but nothing that makes me more comfortable with who I was at that time." Claire settled in her chair and observed him more attentively. There was a tension in his shoulders that wasn't present in previous conversations, a rigidity that suggested that he had encountered something disturbing during his solitary morning research. "Can I help?" she offered, surprising herself with her own initiative. Aaron faced her for a long moment, as if he were evaluating if he could trust her with more intimate information. Finally, he picked up the file that he had been reading and extended it in her direction. "These are reports from a project that we developed between 2018 and 2021, he explained. "A compound called Nemia-9, intended to treat chronic inflammations in patients with severe rheumatoid arthritis. The initial results were promising, but—" He hesitated, running his hand through his hair in the gesture that she was learning to recognize. "But we began to notice side effects that we hadn't anticipated." Claire opened the file and found pages and pages of technical data, efficacy graphs, patient follow-up reports. At first glance, it seemed like a standard medical research project, meticulous and well-documented. But as she leafed through the pages, she began to notice subtle irregularities. There were gaps in the numbering of the reports, as if some pages had been removed. Some patient names were crossed out with black ink, becoming illegible. And there were handwritten notes in the margins, in a feminine handwriting that she didn't recognize. "Who made these notes?" she asked, pointing to the handwritten comments. "Isabella," replied Aaron, and his voice became lower. "She was supervising the ethical aspects of the project. It was her responsibility to ensure that all safety protocols were rigorously followed." Claire examined the notes more closely. Most were technical questions, requests for clarification about dosages and administration frequency. But there were some that seemed to express concern. Patient 47. Unusual reaction, investigate further. Dosage may be too high for demographic profile. Consider temporary suspension until complete review. "She was concerned about the safety of the medication?" asked Claire. "Increasingly," admitted Aaron. "Initially, the side effects seemed minor and controllable. Nausea, occasional headache, mild fatigue. Nothing that would justify the interruption of a project that could benefit millions of people. But Isabella began to document patterns that we didn't want to see." "What kind of patterns?" Aaron got up and walked to the small window, observing the ventilation shaft as if looking for the right words in the darkness out there. "Subtle behavioral alterations," he finally said. "Patients who reported unexplained anxiety, episodes of mental confusion, in some cases, mild hallucinations. Isabella insisted that we needed to interrupt the tests until we better understood these symptoms. I argued that such a small sample of patients wasn't statistically significant." Claire felt a chill in her stomach. There was something in the way he told the story that suggested that this difference of opinion had become something bigger, more personal. "Did you fight because of this?" "We fought because of many things related to this," admitted Aaron, turning to face her. I was convinced that she was being excessively cautious, allowing perfectionism to harm an important medical advance. She was convinced that I was allowing commercial ambition to compromise patient safety. And who was right? The question seemed to hit him physically. Aaron leaned on the wall, closing his eyes for a moment before responding. She was, he said, and the words seemed to cost him considerable effort, as she always was when it came to ethical issues. But I only realized this after it was too late to apologize. Claire closed the file, feeling that she had just crossed an invisible line. The conversation had ceased to be about work and business history to become about guilt, regret, and the pain of losing someone you love in circumstances that could have been avoided. "Aaron," she said softly, "what exactly happened to Isabella?" He opened his eyes and faced her with an expression that mixed gratitude and terror, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask this question directly. "She died testing a modified version of Nemia 9 on herself," he said, "against all protocols, against my pleas, against everything we knew about safety in medical research. She was determined to prove that her concerns were justified, and ended up proving it in a way that none of us could have anticipated." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Claire could feel the weight of Aaron's guilt filling the room like a physical presence. She finally understood why he lived in the office, why he avoided the apartment they had shared, why he carried that permanent tension in his shoulders. "You blame yourself for her death," said Claire. It wasn't a question. "I blame myself for not having listened when she tried to alert me. I blame myself for having prioritized potential profits over patient safety. I blame myself for having transformed our professional disagreement into personal conflict." Aaron paused, breathing deeply. "But mainly, I blame myself for not having realized that she was planning to use herself as a guinea pig." Claire got up and approached him, moved by an impulse that she couldn't control. When she was a few inches away, she could see the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, the vulnerability that he normally hid behind an impeccable corporate facade. "You couldn't have predicted that she would do this," she said. "No rational person could have anticipated such an extreme decision. But I should have known my wife well enough to know that she was capable of anything when she believed she was doing the right thing," replied Aaron. "Isabella was always absolutely integral in her ethical convictions. If she thought Nemia 9 was dangerous, she would do anything to prove it, even risking her own life. Especially risking her own life. She was the type of person who would put the safety of strangers above her own safety without hesitation." Claire felt an involuntary admiration for a woman she never knew, and at the same time a deep compassion for the man who was before her, clearly devastated by the loss of someone he loved and deeply respected. "And after she died?" asked Claire. "What happened to the project?" "We cancelled everything immediately," said Aaron. "We destroyed all stocks of the compound, interrupted the clinical trials, offered free medical follow-up for all patients who had participated in the research. It cost the company almost $20 million, but it was the least we could do. And the patients who presented the side effects that Isabella had documented." Aaron hesitated, and Claire realized that she had touched on something even more sensitive. "Most recovered completely after stopping the medication," he said, "but there were some cases more complicated." "Complicated how?" "Patients who developed persistent psychiatric symptoms, anxiety disorders, psychotic episodes in some cases, self-destructive behavior." Aaron ran his hand through his hair again. "We offered specialized psychiatric treatment, financial compensation, everything we could legally do. But for some people the damage was already done." Claire felt a wave of nausea. The story that Aaron was telling was much worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just about the tragic death of his wife, but about an error of judgment that had caused suffering to dozens of innocent people. "How many patients were affected?" she asked. 73 participated in the clinical trials," replied Aaron. 17 developed psychiatric side effects of some kind. 6 are still in treatment. The numbers were too specific to be invented, and the precision with which Aaron recited them suggested that he had memorized them, carrying them as a personal penance. "Do you still follow these patients?" "Personally," confirmed Aaron. "I receive monthly medical reports, pay for all treatments, meet with the families when requested. It's the least I can do." Claire was overcome by a strange sensation, a mixture of admiration for the way he had assumed responsibility for the mistakes and horror at the extent of the damage caused. She began to understand why Aaron lived like a penitent monk, why he had transformed his personal life into a series of self-imposed privations. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you asked," he said simply. "And because it's been a long time since I've talked with someone who seems genuinely interested in understanding, not in judging." "How can you be sure I won't judge you?" Aaron smiled, and for the first time it was a genuine smile, without the layers of irony and self-protection that normally characterized his expressions. "Because you have kind eyes," he said. "And because, from what I've observed in the last few weeks, you seem to be the type of person who understands that people can make terrible mistakes and still deserve a chance at redemption." The observation caught her off guard. Claire wasn't used to being seen so clearly by someone she had known for such a short time, but there was something in the way Aaron observed her that suggested a deeper understanding of her personality than she was comfortable admitting. "You don't know anything about me," she said, more to protect herself than because she believed the statement. "I know that you work with meticulous care, even when no one is observing. I know that you treat old documents with the same respect that you would treat people. I know that you are cautious with trust, but generous with compassion." Aaron paused. "And I know that you have your own scars that you prefer to keep covered." The reference to the scar on her thigh made her blush involuntarily. Claire had forgotten that he had seen it on the day of the accident with the shelf. "Everyone has scars," she said defensively. "Yes," agreed Aaron, "but not everyone learns to live with them so elegantly." The compliment completely disarmed her. Claire turned to return to her table, needing a moment to process the intensity of the conversation. But when she sat down, she noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. A different folder on her table, which definitely wasn't there on Friday. "What is this?" she asked, pointing to the folder. Aaron followed her gaze, and his expression became more serious. "Documents that I found during my research last night," he said. "Personal correspondence from Isabella that apparently was archived along with the technical reports. I thought you should see them." Claire opened the folder and found several handwritten letters, all on personal letterhead with the initials IS in gold relief. The handwriting was the same that she had seen in the marginal notes of the Nemea 9 reports, but the tone of the letters was completely different. They were personal, intimate, directed to someone identified only as M. She began to read the first letter, dated 6 months before Isabella's death. "My dear M, I can no longer ignore what I'm seeing in the test results. The symptoms that you described in our last conversation are manifesting in other patients as well. I know that Aaron thinks I'm being excessively cautious, but my instinct tells me that we're dealing with something much more dangerous than we imagined. I need to talk to you personally about this. Can you come to New York next week?" Claire moved on to the second letter, dated a month later. "M, after our conversation, I'm even more concerned. What you told me about your mother terrifies me with the possibilities. If there is a genetic predisposition for the psychiatric effects that we are observing, we need to interrupt the tests immediately. Aaron won't like it, but I can no longer remain silent about this." The third letter was dated just 2 weeks before Isabella's death. "M, you were right about everything. The symptoms are worsening and spreading to patients who initially seemed to be responding well to the treatment. I've documented everything carefully, but I know it won't be enough to convince the executive team. They are too financially invested in this project to accept that it may be fundamentally flawed. I'm considering a more dramatic demonstration of my concerns. I know it's risky, but it may be the only way to save other people from going through what your family went through." Claire stopped reading, feeling her heart race. The letter clearly suggested that Isabella had planned to use herself as a guinea pig, not as an impulsive act, but as a calculated strategy to prove her concerns about the safety of the medication. "Who is M?" she asked, raising her eyes to Aaron. "I have no idea," he replied, but there was something in his expression that suggested that he wasn't being completely honest. "Isabella had many medical colleagues with whom she discussed complex cases. It could be any one of them." Claire went back to examining the letters, paying attention to the details that she had missed in the first reading. There were references to your mother, your family, and what you went through. Clearly, M was someone who had been personally affected by something similar to what was happening with the Nemea 9 tests. "Aaron," she said slowly, "are you sure that you don't know anyone whose name begins with M, who may have had personal experience with psychiatric side effects of experimental medications. He hesitated for a moment too long, and Claire realized that she had touched on something that he preferred not to discuss. "Why is this question important to you?" he asked, answering the question with another question. "Because these letters suggest that Isabella had information about other cases, possibly prior to the Nemia 9 tests. If there is a pattern of problems with Sullivan's experimental medications that dates back to earlier, this completely changes the context of her death." Aaron approached the table and sat on the edge, observing her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were being evaluated. "Claire," he said carefully, "there are aspects of my company's history that are more complicated than I would like to admit. Mistakes were made in the past, long before I assumed complete control of operations. Isabella was investigating these mistakes when she died." "What kind of mistakes?" "Clinical trials conducted with inadequate safety protocols. Patients who didn't receive complete information about potential risks, side effects that were minimized or omitted in regulatory reports." Aaron paused. "Mainly during the 80s and 90s, when regulation was less rigorous and government oversight was less effective." Claire felt a wave of uneasiness. The chronology that he was describing coincided with the period of the documents that she was cataloging. Suddenly, her perception of her work changed completely. She wasn't just organizing neutral business history, but potentially documenting evidence of decades of questionable practices. "Do you think I'll find evidence of these problems in the archives that I'm digitizing?" she asked. "It's possible," admitted Aaron. "It's part of the reason why I wanted this work to be done. I prefer to face the complete truth about what this company did in the past, even if it's painful, and if what I find is incriminating." Aaron faced her for a long moment, and Claire saw in him a resolution that she hadn't noticed before, a determination that seemed to have crystallized during his solitary night of research. "Then we'll do the right thing," he said, "regardless of the personal or financial cost." The answer surprised her. Claire had expected evasiveness, perhaps an attempt to minimize possible future discoveries, but Aaron's willingness to face consequences, even if they were devastating, suggested an integrity that she hadn't anticipated. "Why do you trust me with this?" she asked. "Because you're the first person in years who looks at me and sees a person who can change, instead of a person permanently defined by the worst moments of his life." The brutal honesty of the response hit her like a punch in the stomach. Claire realized that she had completely underestimated the depth of Aaron's self-rejection, and also the significance that he attributed to the way she treated him. "Aaron," she said softly, "everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even people who have made terrible mistakes." "Do you really believe that?" "I believe," she replied, and realized that it was true. "But redemption requires more than regret. It requires action." "What kind of action?" Claire thought for a moment, observing the letters spread on the table, the files full of decades of corporate secrets, and the man before her who seemed genuinely determined to face the consequences of his past. "Maybe it starts with finding out who M is," she said, "and ensuring that this person, and anyone else who has been harmed, receives the justice they deserve." Aaron nodded slowly, and Claire saw something change in his expression. The hopelessness that had characterized his features in recent weeks was being replaced by something that seemed like determination. "Would you help me with this?" he asked. The question caught her completely off guard. Claire had expected to continue her cataloging work as a distant observer, not to become an active participant in discovering and possibly exposing decades of corporate misconduct. She began, then stopped. There was something in the situation that attracted her irresistibly. Not just the opportunity to discover the truth, but the chance to help someone who seemed genuinely committed to doing the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. "Yes," she finally said, "I would help." Aaron smiled, and this time it was a smile of pure gratitude, without the layers of protection and irony that she had learned to associate with him. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know what we'll find, but I know that I can't do this alone." Claire nodded, feeling that she had just committed to something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple cataloging job. But she also felt an excitement that she hadn't experienced in years, the prospect of working on something that really mattered, with someone who seemed to value her intelligence and her judgment. "Where do we start?" she asked. First, we finish cataloguing the historical archives, said Aaron. But now we specifically look for references to clinical trials, patients with initials that might correspond to M, and any correspondence that might give us clues about this person's identity. And then? Then we'll find her, said Aaron with a determination that Claire had never heard in his voice before. And we'll discover exactly what happened to her family and to how many other families over the years. Claire nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. There was a sense that they were about to open a door that, once opened, could not be closed again. But there was also a sense that it was the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. When Aaron finally left the room that morning, Claire remained alone with Isabella's letters, and a growing sensation that her life had just changed irreversibly. She had begun that job expecting 3 weeks of solitude and routine cataloguing. Instead, she had become part of a search for truth that could transform not only her own life, but potentially the lives of dozens of other people. And at the center of all this was a man she barely knew, but for whom she felt increasingly attracted, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something in Aaron's vulnerability, in his determination to face the consequences of his mistakes, that awakened in her feelings that she had learned to distrust over the years. As she returned to the cataloguing work, this time specifically looking for clues about the mysterious M, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking towards something that would change her life forever. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if this terrified or excited her more. In the 2 weeks that followed that revealing conversation, Claire's routine changed completely. What was before a solitary cataloguing job became a meticulous investigation, conducted in partnership with Aaron, who now appeared in the archive almost every day. They developed a system. Claire continued digitizing the documents chronologically, but now paid special attention to any reference to clinical trials, names that began with M, or correspondence that seemed personal rather than corporate. Aaron, in turn, brought additional files from his personal office, documents that had belonged to Isabella and that he had never had the courage to examine completely. Together, they mapped connections, created timelines, and tried to reconstruct decades of history that someone had obviously tried to keep buried. It was a rainy Tuesday in April when Claire made the first significant discovery. She was digitizing correspondence from 1989 when she found a series of letters exchanged between the company's founder, Henry Sullivan, Aaron's grandfather, and a doctor from New York named Dr. Marcus Miller. The letters discussed an experimental project called Regenera, intended to treat resistant depression in psychiatric patients. What caught her attention was the tone of the correspondence. Initially cordial and professional, they gradually became more tense, with Dr. Miller expressing growing concerns about the effects of the medication on his patients. In the last letter of the series, dated December 1989, Dr. Miller was categorical. "Mr. Sullivan, I must insist on the immediate interruption of the Regenera tests. The side effects that I have observed in my patients are unacceptable and potentially irreversible. If Sullivan does not voluntarily suspend this project, I will be forced to report my observations to the health authorities." Henry Sullivan's response, dated a week later, was cold and threatening. "Dr. Miller, I remind you that you signed a rigorous confidentiality agreement regarding the details of this project. Any attempt to disclose proprietary information will result in immediate legal action. As for your medical concerns, our internal team disagrees with your assessment. The Regenera project will continue as planned." Claire reread the letters several times, feeling a knot grow in her stomach. There was something in the described dynamic that disturbingly echoed the concerns that Isabella had expressed about Nemia 9, 40 years later. It was as if the company had a historical pattern of ignoring legitimate medical alerts in favor of commercial interests. When Aaron arrived at lunchtime, now an established routine between them, Claire immediately showed him the letters. He read them in silence, and she observed his expression progressively harden. "Did you know this Dr. Miller?" she asked. "Not personally," replied Aaron, but there was something in his voice that suggested that the name wasn't completely strange to him. "My grandfather died when I was 15, and my father didn't usually discuss the details of the company's older projects." "But you've heard this name before?" Aaron hesitated, running his hand through his hair in the gesture that she now recognized as indicative of discomfort. "Maybe," he admitted. A few years ago, when I was organizing my father's personal papers after his death, I found some references to legal problems in the 80s and 90s. I never investigated deeply because they seemed like issues resolved long ago. What kind of legal problems? Lawsuits from patients or families alleging side effects from experimental medications. At the time, I thought they were just the cost of doing business in a regulated industry. Opportunistic attempts to extort money from a successful company. Claire observed him carefully. There was a genuine shame in his expression, as if he was realizing for the first time that his previous interpretation of the events had been naively optimistic. "Do you still have these documents?" she asked. "Probably. They're archived in my office at home." Aaron paused. "Would you like to see them?" The question caught Claire off guard. In the weeks they had worked together in the archive, their relationship had developed into a growing professional intimacy, but always within the confines of the neutral work environment. The idea of going to Aaron's personal apartment represented a significant escalation in their connection. "Yes," she said before she could rethink the decision. "I think it would be important to examine everything we can find." "Would you like to go tonight?" asked Aaron. "I can order Chinese food, and we can work there after we leave here." Claire nodded, feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. There was something in the prospect of seeing Aaron in his personal environment that both attracted and intimidated her simultaneously. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly, with both working in concentrated silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Claire noticed that Aaron seemed tenser than usual, checking the clock frequently and organizing documents with an almost obsessive meticulousness. She wondered if he was as nervous as she was about the change in their usual dynamic. At 6 in the evening, they left the office together, a first. The Wall Street building was at its peak of movement, with hurried executives heading for the subway or calling Ubers. Aaron offered a ride, and Claire accepted, curious to see what kind of car he drove. She was surprised to discover that it was a silver Volkswagen Passat, elegant but not ostentatious. The interior was clean and organized, with only a small water bottle and a document folder in the back seat. It smelled faintly of the same masculine perfume that she had noticed on his jacket weeks ago. "Not what you expected?" asked Aaron, noting her expression. "Honestly, no," admitted Claire. "I thought you would drive something more flashy." "I learned a long time ago that attention isn't always something desirable," said Aaron, maneuvering through the dense traffic of Wall Street, "especially when you want to be left in peace to think." Aaron's apartment was in a discreet building in Brooklyn, far from the luxurious condominiums of the Upper East Side or Greenwich Village that Claire had imagined. The building had an exposed brick facade and large windows, with architecture that suggested comfort rather than ostentation. The apartment itself reflected the personality that she had learned to associate with him. Spacious but not excessive, elegant but functional. The living room had a light wooden floor, worn brown leather sofas that looked comfortable, and shelves full of books that were obviously read rather than decorative. The walls were painted in a neutral beige tone, decorated with some black and white photographs of American landscapes. What caught her attention most was the complete absence of personal photographs. No family images, no wedding portrait, no souvenirs of trips or social events. It was as if Aaron had deliberately erased visual evidence of his personal life. "Did you remove the photographs after Isabella's death?" asked Claire, before realizing that it might be a very personal question. "I put everything in boxes," admitted Aaron. "At the beginning it was too painful to see them. Afterwards it became a habit. Sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring her memory or trying to pretend that our life together never existed." The honesty of the response touched her deeply. Claire could imagine what it would be like to live in a deliberately depersonalized space, surrounded by absences rather than presences. "Could you show me a photo of her?" asked Claire impulsively. Aaron faced her for a moment, seeming to evaluate the request. Finally, he nodded and disappeared for a few minutes into another room. When he returned, he carried a photograph framed in silver. The photo showed a woman of approximately 35 years, with light brown hair tied in a professional bun and intelligent brown eyes behind discreet framed glasses. She was wearing a white coat and smiling at the camera, with an expression that radiated competence and kindness. She was beautiful, but in an accessible way, rather than glamorous. "She looks exactly as I imagined," said Claire. "Intelligent, reliable, integral." "She was all those things," agreed Aaron, observing the photograph with an expression that mixed love and sadness, and stubborn. Incredibly stubborn when she believed she was right about something, like in the concerns about Nemea 9, especially about Nemea 9. Aaron carefully placed the photograph on the center table. Sometimes I wonder if she would still be alive if I had listened to her concerns from the beginning, instead of dismissing them as excess caution. Claire approached him, moved by an impulse to console him that was stronger than her usual caution. "Aaron," she said softly, "you can't remake the past. But you can honor her memory by doing the right thing now." He faced her, and Claire realized that they were much closer to each other than she had planned. She could see the small lines around his eyes, the exact shape of his mouth, the intensity of his blue gaze. There was an electric tension in the air between them that made her realize that their relationship had evolved far beyond a professional partnership. "Claire," said Aaron, and his voice was lower than normal, "you know that I—" He was interrupted by the ring of the building's intercom. The delivery man from the Chinese food had arrived, breaking the moment of intimacy that had developed between them. Aaron moved away to answer, and Claire used the interruption to recompose herself, realizing that her heart was beating faster than normal. They dined at the kitchen table, a simple meal of kung pao chicken and lo mein that they shared, while discussing strategies for examining Aaron's personal documents. The conversation was professional, but there was an undercurrent of mutual awareness that made each interaction laden with additional meaning. After dinner, Aaron led her to a small office adjacent to the master bedroom. The room was functional rather than comfortable, with a dark wooden desk, ergonomic chairs and metal files aligned against an entire wall. It was clearly where he conducted work that he preferred to keep separate from the corporate office. "The documents that I mentioned are in these 3 files," said Aaron, pointing to specific drawers. "I've never examined them systematically, so I don't know exactly what we'll find." They began to work, each taking a different file. Claire quickly realized that the documents were organized chronologically, but in a much more casual way than the corporate archives that she had catalogued. There were legal contracts mixed with personal correspondence, newspaper clippings along with medical reports, an eclectic collection that reflected decades of business and personal life. It was in the second file that Claire found something that made her stop completely. Among documents from 1987, there was a manila folder labeled Miller Case Confidential. Inside, she found detailed legal correspondence about a lawsuit filed by Dr. Marcus Miller on behalf of a patient identified only as CM. According to the documents, CM was a 28-year-old woman who had participated in the tests of the Regenera medication in 1989. After 3 months of treatment, she had developed severe psychiatric symptoms, including paranoia, visual hallucinations, and episodes of self-destructive behavior. Dr. Miller argued that these symptoms were a direct result of the experimental medication and that Sullivan had failed to provide adequate information about potential risks. Claire's heart began to beat faster as she read the medical details. The description of the symptoms was disturbingly specific and familiar, but it was when she reached the end of the document that she felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Attached to the lawsuit was a copy of the patient's birth certificate. Claire Mitchell, born on March 15, 1961, daughter of Camille Mitchell, French immigrant. Claire let the documents fall, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Claire Mitchell, CM, her mother. "Claire," Aaron's voice came from very far away, as if she were hearing through water. "What is it? Are you okay?" She couldn't answer. Her hands were trembling so much that she couldn't hold the papers, and there was a buzz in her ears that made it difficult to process coherent thoughts. Her mother had been a guinea pig in Sullivan's tests. The psychiatric symptoms that she had developed, the paranoia and erratic behavior that Claire vaguely remembered from her early childhood, had all been the result of an experimental medication. "Claire, talk to me," said Aaron, and she realized that he was kneeling next to her chair, his hands gently holding her shoulders. "What did you find?" With great effort, she managed to point to the documents scattered on the floor. Aaron collected them and began to read, and Claire observed his expression change from concern to horror when he understood the implications. "Oh my God," he murmured. "Claire, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "My mother," managed to say Claire, her voice coming out as a whisper. "It was her. CM Claire Mitchell. My mother was one of your family's guinea pigs. Aaron sat heavily on the floor next to her chair, the documents still in his hands. His expression was one of complete shock, as if he had just discovered something that fundamentally changed his understanding of everything. That's why she disappeared, continued Claire, the pieces finally fitting together in her mind. The psychiatric symptoms, the erratic behavior that I barely remember. She didn't abandon us by choice. She was sick, and the sickness was caused by your company's medication. Claire, Aaron began, but she interrupted him. Did you know? She asked, turning to face him directly. When you hired me, when you started appearing in the archive, did you know who I was? The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Claire observed Aaron visibly struggle with an answer, and his hesitation was answer enough. I suspected, he finally admitted. When I saw your full name on the work contract, Claire Mitchell, it made me vaguely remember something. But I wasn't sure until I saw the scar on your leg. The scar? Claire didn't understand the connection. There's a photograph in your mother's medical files, explained Aaron, his voice barely above a whisper. An identification photo taken when she entered the clinical trials. You are identical to her at that age. And in the medical report, there's a note about a scar on the left thigh, the result of an accident in childhood. Claire felt as if she had been physically hit. Everything had been a lie. The job, the casual encounters, the intimate conversations, even the attraction that she had felt growing between them. Everything had been based on an elaborate farce. So all of this was planned, she said, abruptly rising from the chair. You hired me because you knew who I was. All the conversations, all this proximity was just part of some plan to manipulate me. No, said Aaron, also standing up. Claire, please, let me explain. Yes, I suspected who you might be when I hired you. But everything that happened afterwards, everything I felt for you, is completely genuine. How can I believe you? Claire felt tears burning her eyes, a combination of anger, betrayal, and pain that was almost overwhelming. How can I trust anything you've told me? Because you know me, said Aaron desperately. In the last few weeks, you've seen me in a way that no one else has in years. The person you've known, the vulnerability that I showed, the feelings that I developed for you, all of this is real. But it was based on a lie from the beginning, returned Claire. You manipulated me to get close to me, probably to control what I might discover about my mother. That's not true, insisted Aaron. Initially, perhaps I had questionable motivations. But as I got to know you, everything changed. You changed everything for me. Claire faced him, trying to find some sign of sincerity in his expression. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted the feelings that she had developed to be based on something real. But the revelation had shaken her trust in a fundamental way. I need to go, she said, picking up her bag and heading for the door. Claire, please. Aaron followed her. Don't end it like this. We can talk about this. We can resolve. There's nothing to resolve, she said, turning to face him one last time. You lied to me from the moment we met. You used my family's tragedy to manipulate me. How can I have any kind of relationship with someone capable of that? Because you know that I've changed, said Aaron, and there was a hopelessness in his voice that almost made her hesitate. Because you know that I'm capable of being a better person than I was. Claire stopped at the door, her hands trembling as she turned the knob. Part of her wanted to turn around, wanted to give him a chance to explain completely, wanted to believe that the feelings they had developed for each other could survive this devastating revelation. But the pain of betrayal was too intense, too fresh. She needed time to process everything she had discovered, to determine if she could separate the man she had known from the lies that had founded their relationship. I need time, she finally said. I need to understand what all this means before I can decide anything about us. How much time? Asked Aaron. I don't know, admitted Claire. Maybe a lot. Maybe forever. With that, she left, leaving Aaron alone in his depersonalized apartment, surrounded by the documents that had simultaneously revealed the truth and destroyed any chance of a future together. On the street, Claire called an Uber with hands that were still trembling. During the trip back to her own apartment, she tried to process everything she had discovered. Her mother hadn't been an unstable immigrant who had abandoned the family. She had been a victim of inadequate medical tests, a woman who had developed severe psychiatric symptoms as a result of an experimental medication that should never have been tested on human beings. And Aaron. The man for whom she had begun to develop deep feelings, the man who seemed so vulnerable and genuine, had been capable of elaborate manipulation from the moment they met. But while anger and the feeling of betrayal dominated her thoughts, there was a small voice in her mind that questioned whether her reaction had been completely fair. Aaron had tried to explain, had insisted that his feelings for her were genuine despite his initially questionable motivations, and she had witnessed his vulnerability, his genuine remorse about past mistakes, his determination to make things right. Was it possible that someone could begin a relationship for questionable reasons and still develop genuine feelings? Was it possible that redemption could coexist with initial deception? Claire didn't know the answers to these questions, but as the Uber navigated through the night streets of New York, she realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She had discovered truths about her family that she had sought for years. She had found evidence of decades of corporate misconduct that could potentially bring justice for other families like hers. The 10 days that followed were the longest of Claire's life. She didn't return to the Sullivan Foundation archive, didn't answer the calls that Aaron made in the first 3 days, didn't open the emails that he sent with subjects like, "Please, let me explain," and "You need to know the complete truth." Instead, she immersed herself in her own investigation, using all the resources she could gather to discover more about her mother's case and potential other victims. She began at the New York State Public Archives, spending hours among dusty documents and old microfiches, looking for any reference to lawsuits against Sullivan Biotech in the 80s and 90s. The work was tedious and often frustrating, but Claire felt driven by an almost obsessive need to completely understand what had happened to her family. It was on a rainy Thursday, while examining archived lawsuits from 1990, that she found the first significant clue. Among dozens of routine corporate lawsuits, she discovered 3 additional cases filed against Sullivan by patients who had participated in experimental clinical trials. The names were different, but the symptoms described were disturbingly similar to those her mother had developed: paranoia, hallucinations, self-destructive behavior, progressive mental deterioration. What shocked her most was discovering that all the cases had been settled out of court, with confidentiality agreements that prevented the victims from publicly discussing their experiences. It was as if the company had systematically silenced anyone who could expose their questionable research methods. Claire copied all the documents she could find and took them home, spreading them on her dining table like pieces of a macabre puzzle. She was beginning to see a pattern: poorly regulated clinical trials, vulnerable patients used as guinea pigs, side effects minimized or ignored, evidence buried through legal agreements. Her mother had been just one victim in a long list of people harmed by the unbridled ambition of a pharmaceutical company that placed profits above human safety. On Saturday morning, Claire made a decision that surprised her. She would look for the other victims or their families. If she could find them, perhaps she could build a stronger case for public exposure. Perhaps she could ensure that other people wouldn't suffer the same fate. She began with Maria Sanders, a 32-year-old woman who had participated in tests of an experimental antidepressant in 1988. According to the court documents, she had developed severe psychotic symptoms after 3 months of treatment and had never fully recovered. The lawsuit had been filed by her brother, John Sanders, on her behalf. Claire found John Sanders working as a mechanic in a garage in the Bronx. He was a man in his 60s with calloused hands and tired eyes that hardened immediately when she mentioned the name Sullivan. "I don't talk about that," he said, wiping his hands on a dirty cloth. "I signed papers. I can't talk." "I understand," said Claire softly, "but my mother was also a victim of their tests. I'm trying to discover the truth, not to sue anyone, but to understand what really happened." John observed her more carefully, and Claire saw something change in his expression, a caution that slowly transformed into recognition of a shared pain. "Your mother also participated in the tests?" he asked. "Yes. Claire Mitchell in the Regenera tests in 1989. John nodded slowly, as if the name were familiar to him. "My sister talked about a French woman," he said. "In the last lucid days she had, before getting completely worse. She said she had met a French woman in the tests who was also beginning to have problems." Claire felt her heart accelerate. Her mother and Maria Sanders had met, had shared the experience of being guinea pigs in the same experimental program. "May I ask what happened to your sister?" asked Claire. John looked around the garage, making sure they were alone, before answering. "Maria never recovered," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The symptoms she developed during the tests continued for the rest of her life. Paranoia, hallucinations, violent episodes. She spent the last 20 years of her life going in and out of psychiatric hospitals. She died 2 years ago, alone, in a state institution. The story was heartbreaking, and Claire felt tears burning her eyes. Another life destroyed by Sullivan's irresponsible experiments. "Did the confidentiality agreement prevent you from seeking other treatments?" she asked. "It prevented us from doing anything," said John bitterly. "We couldn't talk to the press. We couldn't share medical information with other doctors without the company's authorization. We couldn't even mention the name of the medication she had taken. It was as if they had bought our silence with dirty money." Claire spent another hour talking with John, collecting details about Maria's experience and learning more about the methods that Sullivan had used to silence its victims. When she finally said goodbye, John gave her information that would completely change her investigation. "If you really want to understand what happened," he said, "you should look for Dr. Marcus Miller. He's still alive, retired, but still lives in New York. He was the only doctor who tried to fight against them at the time." Claire left the garage with a heavy heart, but determined. Dr. Miller, the same doctor whose letters she had found in the archives, was alive and possibly willing to talk. If anyone had answers about what really happened in Sullivan's experimental tests, it would be him. It took 2 days to locate Dr. Marcus Miller. At 82, he lived in a modest apartment on the Upper East Side, near the center of Manhattan. When Claire called explaining who she was and what she was looking for, there was a long silence before he agreed to receive her. "Doctor." Miller was a tall, thin man, with completely white hair and brown eyes that still shone with intelligence, despite his advanced age. His apartment was full of medical books, family photographs, and diplomas that documented a long and respected career in psychiatry. "So you're Claire's daughter," he said, offering her tea in a delicate porcelain cup. "I remember her well. Her kind, intelligent woman, who trusted me when I promised that the experimental treatment would help her with her postpartum depression." Postpartum depression? Claire had never heard this part of the story. "Your mother developed severe depression after your birth," explained Dr. Miller. "It was common at the time for traditional treatments to be ineffective for more severe cases. When Sullivan offered the opportunity to participate in clinical trials of a new antidepressant, it seemed like a blessing. But something went wrong?" Dr. Miller got up and walked to a bookshelf, removing an old manila folder. "Everything went wrong," he said. "The medication that Sullivan was testing wasn't a common antidepressant. It was an experimental compound that acted directly on the central nervous system, with effects that they didn't completely understand." He opened the folder and showed Claire pages of handwritten medical notes, patient progress charts, and clinical photographs that documented the progressive deterioration of the test participants. "Initially, the results seemed promising," continued Dr. Miller. "The patients reported significant improvement in depressive symptoms, but after a few weeks, they began to develop side effects that we hadn't anticipated. The psychotic symptoms that you mentioned in your letters to Henry Sullivan." Dr. Miller nodded gravely. "Visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, episodes of violent behavior. Your mother was one of the first to develop these symptoms, and when I tried to alert Sullivan about the problem, I was dismissed as alarmist. And then, her condition worsened rapidly. The hallucinations became constant, the paranoia so severe that she could no longer adequately care for you. She was hospitalized several times, but nothing we did seemed to help. The damage caused by the experimental medication seemed to be irreversible." Claire felt tears running down her face. Finally, she was hearing the complete truth about what had happened to her mother. "Why did she disappear?" she asked. Dr. Miller hesitated, clearly reluctant to share the most painful part of the story. "In the last months before disappearing, your mother had moments of lucidity where she realized what she had become," he said softly. "She knew that she could no longer be the mother that you deserved. In one of these lucid moments, she told me she was going away to protect you from her own instability. She chose to leave us. She chose to sacrifice her own happiness to protect you from witnessing her complete mental deterioration," corrected Dr. Miller. "It was an act of desperate love from a mother who knew she was losing the battle against her own mind." Claire cried openly then, grieving not just for the mother she had lost, but for the brave woman who had been forced to make an impossible decision because of a pharmaceutical company's negligence. "Dr. Miller," she said when she finally managed to compose herself, "why did you never make this public? Why did you allow Sullivan to silence you?" The elderly doctor sighed deeply. "I tried," he said. "I wrote to health authorities, contacted journalists, even considered going to the international press. But Sullivan had powerful lawyers and unlimited resources. They threatened to destroy my career, sue me for breach of medical confidentiality, even suggest that I was mentally unstable. And you gave up? I was a solitary doctor fighting against a pharmaceutical conglomerate with political connections and legal resources that I couldn't combat. Eventually, I realized that the only thing I would achieve would be to destroy my ability to help other patients." Claire understood. Dr. Miller had faced the same impossible choice that Isabella Sullivan would face decades later: fight against a corrupt system and potentially destroy his own life in the process, or find more subtle ways to make a difference. "But you kept everything," observed Claire, looking at the documents spread on the table. "Waiting for the right day," confirmed Dr. Miller, "waiting for someone with the courage and the necessary resources to finally bring justice for the victims. Someone like me?" Dr. Miller smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "Someone exactly like you," he said. "The daughter of Claire Mitchell, who grew up strong and determined, who has every right to demand accountability for what was done to her family." Claire spent the rest of the afternoon with Dr. Miller, copying documents, listening to stories about her mother and other patients, and learning about the full extent of Sullivan's misconduct during the 80s and 90s. When she finally said goodbye, she carried a box full of evidence that could finally expose decades of irresponsible human experimentation. But as she drove back home, Claire couldn't stop thinking about Aaron. During her entire investigation, she had tried to suppress thoughts about him, focusing instead on her quest for truth about her mother. But Dr. Miller had mentioned something that forced her to reconsider her opinion about Aaron's motivations. "Henry Sullivan's grandson," the elderly doctor had said when she mentioned working for the company. "I heard that he is different from the grandfather, that he's been trying to make changes to operate more ethically. Is that true?" Claire hadn't known how to respond. Her anger about Aaron's initial deception was still raw, but she also couldn't deny that during their weeks working together, she had witnessed genuine remorse and determination to do the right thing. When she arrived home, she found an envelope that had been delivered by hand. Inside, there was a handwritten letter in Aaron's familiar handwriting. "Claire, I know you don't want to talk to me now, and I understand why. But there are things you need to know that I couldn't explain the other night. First, about knowing who you were. It's true that I suspected, but my suspicions weren't about controlling what you might discover. They were about finding a way to finally make things right for your family, and others like yours. Second, the investigative fund that I mentioned I've already established, with $20 million initially committed to compensate victims and support further investigation, regardless of the personal consequences to me or the company. Third, I understand if you never want to see me again. But I need you to know that meeting you wasn't just about addressing the past. As I got to know you, your intelligence, your integrity, your compassion, I found myself drawn to you in ways I never anticipated. What began as guilt became something much more real. If you're willing to talk even just once more, I'll be at the bench near the oak tree in Prospect Park on Sunday at noon. If you don't come, I'll understand, and I won't contact you again. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm committed to exposing the truth about what my family's company did to your mother and others. That commitment stands regardless of your decision about us." With deepest regret and hope, Aaron Clare spent 3 entire days thinking about Aaron's letter, reading it repeatedly, while organizing all the evidence she had collected about Sullivan's historical crimes. Her dining table had been transformed into an improvised operations center, covered with medical documents, photographs of victims, confidential legal agreements, and testimonies that painted a devastating picture of decades of irresponsible human experimentation. On Sunday morning, she finally made a decision. She couldn't ignore that Aaron possessed resources and access that she would never have alone. If she truly wanted justice for her mother and all the other victims, she would need to work with him, regardless of her complicated personal feelings. But this time, it would be on her own terms. She called the private number he had left in the letter, and Aaron answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting by the phone. "Claire," he said, and she could hear a mixture of hope and apprehension in his voice. "I need to talk to you," she said, keeping her tone professional. "About the letter, about what you offered, about how we can do this the right way." "When?" "Wherever you want. This afternoon at my apartment, 3 o'clock, and Aaron—" She made a deliberate pause. "Come prepared to see exactly what your family did to innocent people. Because if we're going to do this together, you need to completely understand the extent of the damage that needs to be repaired." When Aaron arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, Claire was nervous in a way she hadn't expected. She had mentally rehearsed how it would be to see him again, but hadn't anticipated how his presence would still affect her physically. He looked thinner than when they had separated, with more pronounced dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that suggested sleepless nights. He was wearing jeans and a simple blue shirt, no tie or jacket, a choice that she interpreted as deliberate. He didn't want to appear as the powerful corporate executive, but simply as a man asking for a second chance. "Thank you," he said when she opened the door, "for giving me this opportunity." Claire didn't respond immediately, only led him to the living room, where she had carefully organized all the evidence she had collected. The coffee table was covered with photographs, medical documents, and testimonies. The walls were lined with a timeline she had created, showing decades of systematic abuses. "Sit down," she said, pointing to the sofa, "and look around, really look, because this is what your company, your family, did to real people." Aaron sat down slowly, his eyes scanning the documents and photographs. Claire observed his expression gradually change from apprehension to horror as he began to comprehend the full scale of the crimes that had been committed in Sullivan's name. "My God," he murmured, picking up a photograph that showed Maria Sanders before and after the experimental tests. The transformation was shocking, from a smiling, healthy woman to someone with empty eyes and a permanent expression of terror. "There are 17 documented cases," said Claire, her voice controlled but laden with emotion. 17 people who trusted your company and had their lives destroyed. And these are just the cases I could find. There are probably many more." Aaron continued examining the documents, and Claire saw tears forming in his eyes as he read John Sanders' testimony about his sister's final years. "This is just a small sample," continued Claire. "Doctor, Miller gave me access to medical records that show the pattern. Always the same. Vulnerable patients, incomplete information about risks, side effects minimized or ignored, evidence buried through legal agreements." "Claire," said Aaron, his voice barely above a whisper, "I swear I didn't know it was this extensive. I knew there were problems in the past, but this—" he gestured toward the documents. "This is systematic, this is criminal." "Yes," agreed Claire, "it's criminal. And that's why I need to know if you're genuinely committed to doing the right thing, or if you're trying to minimize the damage to protect the company's reputation." Aaron got up and walked to the wall where she had created the timeline. He studied it carefully, paying special attention to the dates and the names of the victims. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, turning to face her. "Tell me exactly what needs to happen to begin making justice for these people." Claire had prepared a list, but hesitated for a moment, observing Aaron's expression. There was something different about him, a resolution that went beyond guilt or self-pity. He seemed genuinely determined to face the consequences, regardless of the personal cost. "First," she said, "all confidentiality agreements need to be formally dissolved, and all victims or families need to be notified that they're free to speak publicly." "I've already begun that process," said Aaron. "My lawyers are preparing the necessary documentation. Second, each victim or family needs to receive adequate medical and financial compensation, not as a silencing payment, but as genuine recognition of the harm caused." "The fund that I mentioned in the letter has already been established," said Aaron. $20 million initially, with more resources available as needed. Claire was caught by surprise at how quickly he had acted. "Third," she continued, "the complete story needs to be made public, not an edited or minimized version, but the complete truth about what Sullivan did for decades." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Claire took a deep breath. This was the riskiest part of her plan. "A press conference," she said. "You, me, Dr. Miller, and any victim or family member who is willing to speak. We tell the whole story, Present all the evidence and let the public judge. Aaron nodded slowly. That will probably destroy the company, he said, and certainly destroy my personal reputation. I know, said Claire. The question is, are you willing to accept those consequences to do the right thing? Aaron faced her for a long moment, and Claire saw in him the same vulnerability that she had observed in their first intimate conversations in the archive. But now there was something more, a determination that transcended self-interest. Yes, he said simply, I'm willing. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because I can't live anymore knowing that I'm building my life on the suffering of innocent people. Claire felt something change inside her. During the weeks of anger and betrayal, she had almost forgotten why she had felt attracted to Aaron initially. It wasn't just his appearance or power, but this capacity for genuine vulnerability, this willingness to face difficult truths about himself. There's one additional condition, she said. What? I lead this investigation. I'm no longer your employee or your junior partner. I'm someone who is personally affected by your company's crimes, and I want to have control over how the truth is revealed. Aaron smiled, the first genuine smile that she had seen from him since their separation. I wouldn't expect anything different, he said. You're stronger and more capable than I ever gave you credit for. It will be an honor to follow your leadership in this. In the days that followed, Claire and Aaron worked together with an intensity that was simultaneously professional and intensely personal. They had established a temporary office in his apartment, transforming the living room into an operations center, where they organized evidence, contacted victims, and coordinated with lawyers and journalists. The dynamic between them had changed completely. Claire was no longer the shy employee impressed by the attention of a powerful executive. She was a determined investigator leading a search for justice, and Aaron had assumed the role of following her leadership, offering resources and access without trying to control the direction of the investigation. But working in physical proximity again brought back feelings that both had tried to suppress. There were moments when their hands accidentally touched while organizing documents, when she caught him observing her with admiration as she conducted phone interviews with victims, when he demonstrated genuine deference to her decisions, that the romantic tension between them became almost tangible. It was during one of these late working sessions on a Thursday night that the first moment of true intimacy since their separation happened. Claire was organizing victim testimonies when she found a photograph she hadn't seen before. Her mother, smiling, holding baby Claire in her arms. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "In my father's personal files," replied Aaron. "I've been searching through everything related to your mother's case. This was in an envelope marked Mitchell, Personal Effects. I thought you should have it." Claire stared at the photograph, tears filling her eyes. Her mother looked so young, so full of life, her smile radiating a joy that Claire had never witnessed in her fragmented childhood memories. "She was beautiful," said Aaron softly, coming to stand beside her. "You look so much like her." "I wish I could remember her like this," whispered Claire. "All I have are vague images of someone increasingly frightened, increasingly unstable. This woman, the one in this photo, is a stranger to me." Aaron hesitated, then gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Claire," he said, "I can't change what my family did to your mother. I can't give you back the childhood you should have had. But I can promise you that from this moment forward, I will do everything in my power to honor her memory by making sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else again." Claire turned to face him, and for the first time since discovering the truth about her mother, she allowed herself to truly see the man standing before her, not as the heir to the company that had destroyed her family, but as someone fighting his own battle for redemption. "I believe you," she said, and realized it was true. Despite everything, despite the initial deception, she believed in his commitment to doing the right thing. Aaron's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, standing together amid the ruins of decades of secrets and pain, tentatively finding their way towards something that might someday resemble forgiveness. The morning of the press conference dawned grey and rainy in New York, as if the sky itself reflected the gravity of what was about to be revealed. Claire woke at 5 in the morning in Aaron's apartment, where she had spent the night organizing the final details of the presentation. They had worked until almost 2 in the morning, reviewing each document, each testimony, each piece of evidence that would be presented to the public. She found Aaron in the kitchen, already dressed in a dark suit and black tie, a deliberate choice that conveyed seriousness and mourning for the victims who would be honored today. He was preparing coffee with slightly trembling hands, and Claire realized that despite his determination, he was also nervous about what was about to happen. "Good morning," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "Good morning," he replied, turning to face her. "Ready to change the world?" "Ready to tell the truth," corrected Claire. "The world will decide what to do with it." At 9 in the morning, they arrived at the Plaza Hotel in central Manhattan, where the press conference had been organized. Claire had chosen the location deliberately. It was prestigious enough to attract the attention of national and international media, but not so luxurious that it would seem insensitive to the victims' situation. The hall was packed. There were journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, as well as correspondents from CNN International, BBC, and international news agencies. Television cameras lined the walls, and Claire could see technicians adjusting live broadcast equipment. In the front row sat the people who really mattered. Dr. Marcus Miller, elegant at 82 but with eyes that shone with decades of determination finally vindicated. John Sanders, uncomfortable in his borrowed suit, but with a dignity that transcended his clothes. Dr. Sandra Lee, the psychiatrist who had treated the most recent victims, with a folder full of medical evidence, and 3 people that Claire had never met personally, but whose stories she had memorized, family members of other victims who had agreed to speak publicly for the first time. Aaron sat next to Claire at the main table, and she noticed how he observed each face in the audience, as if trying to memorize the moment when his life would change forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," Claire began, her voice firm despite her nerves, "thank you for coming today. What you are going to hear will be difficult to process. It will be about decades of irresponsible human experimentation, about lives destroyed by corporate greed, and about a system that allowed crimes against vulnerable people to be committed and covered up for more than 40 years. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle in the room. "My name is Claire Mitchell, and my mother, Claire Mitchell Sr., was one of the victims of Sullivan Biotech's experiments. For years, I believed that she had abandoned us due to mental instability. Today I know that she was a victim of clinical trials that destroyed her mind and forced her to make the most painful decision a mother can make, leaving her child to protect them from her own medication-induced mental deterioration." Claire observed as journalists leaned forward, pens moving quickly over notepads, cameras focusing on her expression. "With me today is Dr. Marcus Miller, who was one of the few courageous medical professionals who tried to expose these crimes at the time. Dr. Miller." The elderly doctor rose with dignity, approaching the microphone with firm steps that belied his age. "For 40 years, he began, his voice clear and authoritative, I carried the weight of knowing that innocent people had been harmed by experiments that I should have been able to stop. Today, I can finally tell the complete truth about what Sullivan Biotech did to vulnerable patients, including Claire's mother." During the next 20 minutes, Dr. Miller methodically detailed the crimes he had witnessed. Patients who hadn't received complete information about risks, side effects that were minimized or omitted, evidence of harm that was buried through intimidating legal agreements. When he finished, Claire called John Sanders to the microphone. The mechanic, clearly nervous but determined, told the story of his sister Maria with a raw honesty that made several people in the audience openly cry. "My sister was a kind person," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "She trusted when the doctors said that the experimental medication would help her. Instead, it destroyed her mind. She spent the last 20 years of her life going in and out of psychiatric hospitals, dying alone and frightened. And during all that time, we couldn't even talk about what had caused her condition, because we had signed papers that prohibited us from telling the truth." When John returned to his place, Claire saw that many journalists were visibly moved. This wasn't just a story about abstract corporate misconduct. It was about real people, real families, real lives destroyed. Then came the moment that Claire had both feared and anticipated the most. Dr. Sandra Lee presented evidence of the most recent cases. "The historical victims of Sullivan deserve justice," said Dr. Lee, "but it's crucial that you understand that these crimes didn't stop decades ago. In the last 3 years, I've treated patients who developed severe psychiatric symptoms after participating in Sullivan's clinical trials, and there's evidence that some of these patients continued receiving experimental medications without their knowledge or full consent. The revelation caused a commotion in the room. Camera flashes went off, journalists began making frantic notes, and Claire could hear murmurs of shock and indignation. Finally, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Aaron approached the microphone. The room became completely silent. Here was the heir to the Sullivan empire, about to speak about his own company's crimes. Claire observed him carefully, still partially unable to believe that he would really do this, that he would sacrifice everything for justice. "My name is Aaron Sullivan," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I am the current CEO of Sullivan Biotech, and I am here to take full responsibility for the crimes that this company committed over decades." He paused, and Claire saw that his hands were trembling slightly as he held his notes. "Everything that you heard today is true. My company, my family, harmed innocent people in the name of profit and scientific progress. We experimented on vulnerable human beings, minimized risks, buried evidence of harm, and used our legal and financial power to silence victims." The direct and unreserved confession caused another wave of commotion in the room. "But I want to be clear about something," continued Aaron. "I'm not here today to offer empty apologies or try to minimize the extent of our crimes. I'm here to announce concrete actions that are already being implemented." He straightened up, and Claire saw the determination in his posture. "First, all confidentiality agreements with victims or families of victims have been formally dissolved. You are free to speak about your experiences without fear of legal retaliation. Second, we have established a compensation fund of $50 million to provide medical care and financial support to all victims of Sullivan's experiments, dating from 1980 to today. Third, we have delivered all files related to these experiments to the appropriate authorities for criminal investigation. We will not attempt to obstruct any investigation or prosecution. Fourth, Sullivan Biotech will be voluntarily dissolved. Our assets will be sold, and all resources will be directed toward victim compensation and ethical medical research." The last statement caused a stunned silence in the room. Claire turned to look at Aaron, also surprised. They had discussed serious consequences, but she hadn't expected him to go so far as to completely dissolve the company. "Finally," said Aaron, his voice becoming more personal, "I want to speak directly to the victims and families who are here today and those who are watching at home. I know that no amount of money or words can undo the harm that was caused. I know that my apologies may seem inadequate in the face of the magnitude of what was lost, but I want you to know that I dedicate the rest of my life to trying to make reparations, not through grandiose gestures, but through daily, consistent work to ensure that this never happens again." When Aaron returned to his place, Claire stood up to make the final statements. "Before we answer questions," she said, "I want to make one thing clear. This press conference isn't about vengeance. It's about truth, transparency, and justice. It's about ensuring that the victims of Sullivan's experiments finally have their stories heard and their suffering acknowledged." The questions from the journalists were intense and relentless. They lasted almost 2 hours, covering everything from specific medical details to legal and financial implications. Claire and Aaron answered each question with complete honesty, even when it meant revealing information that put them in an even more vulnerable position. When the press conference finally ended, Claire felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. They had done it. They had told the complete truth to the world, regardless of the personal consequences. In the days that followed, the repercussions were monumental. The story was headline news in all major American newspapers and gained significant international coverage. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation, the FBI opened a criminal inquiry, and congressional hearings were convened. But for Claire, the most significant consequences were personal. Finally, after decades, she had answers about her mother. More importantly, she saw other families receiving the answers and the acknowledgement that they had also sought for years. John Sanders called 3 days after the press conference, crying on the phone. "Claire," he said, "for the first time in 20 years, I can talk about my sister without fear. I can tell people what really happened to her. You don't know what this means to me." Dr. Miller also reached out to her, his voice full of a satisfaction that he had waited for decades. "Finally," said the elderly doctor, "I can sleep at night knowing that I fulfilled my professional and moral duty. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak." As for Aaron, the consequences were professionally devastating but personally transformative. As he had predicted, his business reputation was completely destroyed. Investigations revealed other problems that had been covered up over the years, and he faced multiple criminal and civil lawsuits. But Claire observed with admiration how he handled each development with dignity and responsibility. He never tried to minimize his guilt, never hired public relations to clean up his image, never looked for ways to avoid consequences. Instead, he cooperated completely with all investigations and dedicated every free moment to working with organizations that supported victims of inadequate medical experiments. It was 6 months after the press conference that changed their lives when Claire and Aaron faced the final test of their relationship. Aaron had been criminally indicted for corporate negligence and was facing the possibility of prison. Claire, on the other hand, had become a respected public figure, receiving prestigious job offers and invitations to speak at international conferences on medical ethics. It was a cold July night when Aaron came to Claire's apartment for a conversation that both knew would be crucial for their future together. "Claire," he said, sitting in the living room where she had first organized all the evidence of his company's crimes, "I need you to know that I don't expect you to stay with me through all of this." "What do you mean?" she asked, although she suspected she already knew. "You have a new life now. Opportunities that you would never have had if you hadn't become associated with me and all these scandals. You could have any career you wanted, anywhere in the world. It wouldn't be fair for you to be dragged down by the consequences of my past choices." Claire observed him carefully, seeing in him not the powerful executive she had originally met, not even the man tormented by guilt who had fallen in love with her, but someone new, someone who had found a fundamental integrity through the process of facing the consequences of his actions. "Aaron," she said, standing up and approaching the chair where he was seated, "do you really think I would go through all of this? The investigation, the press conference, all the consequences, just to abandon you when things got difficult? But you could have a much better life without me," he insisted. "A career, a reputation, a future that isn't complicated by my family's crimes." Claire knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Aaron, you still don't understand," she said softly. "I didn't fall in love with the CEO of Sullivan. I didn't fall in love with the rich and powerful man. I fell in love with the man who had the courage to sacrifice everything to do the right thing. I fell in love with the person you became when you decided that truth was more important than your reputation." Tears formed in Aaron's eyes. "But I lied to you at the beginning," he said. "I manipulated you to get close to me." "Yes, you did," agreed Claire, "and that hurt me deeply. But over the last few months you've proved that people can change, that they can choose to be better than they were in the past. You're no longer the man who initially lied to me. You've become someone who would choose the truth, even when it's painful." "And if I go to prison?" asked Aaron. "And if the investigations reveal even more problems? Would you still be able to stay with me?" Claire smiled, the first genuine and uncomplicated smile that she had given him since discovering the truth about her mother. "Aaron," she said, "I've spent my whole life looking for someone who would see me as a complete person, who would respect my strength, who would be honest with me even when honesty was inconvenient. You've become that person. No matter where this path takes us, I want to walk it by your side." That night, for the first time since they had met, Claire and Aaron made love without secrets between them, without unresolved lies, without guilt or manipulation complicating their feelings. It was a union based on complete knowledge of each other, including flaws and mistakes, and a conscious choice to build a future together. In the 2 years that followed, their lives were transformed in ways that neither could have anticipated. Aaron was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but received probation due to his complete cooperation with the investigations and his extensive work with victim organizations. Claire became the director of a new international organization dedicated to the ethical oversight of medical research, traveling the world to speak about the dangers of inadequate human experimentation. They married in a simple ceremony in the garden of the house they bought together in Brooklyn, a modest house but full of light, where Claire finally hung the photograph of her mother in a place of honor in the living room. The ceremony was small, Just a few close friends and the people who had become family through their shared search for justice. Dr. Miller, who officiated the ceremony as an ordained minister, John Sanders and his wife, Dr. Sandra Lee, and several other families of victims who had become part of their extended community. During their vows, Claire looked into Aaron's eyes and saw in them not the man she had initially met, but the man he had chosen to become. "I promise," she said, "to love not only who you are today, but to support who you choose to be each day. I promise that we will build our future on truth, transparency, and a shared commitment to making a difference in the world." "I promise," replied Aaron, "to spend each day of the rest of my life proving that I deserve the love and trust that you have given me. I promise that our love will be based not just on feeling, but on consistent actions of honesty, respect, and mutual dedication." 5 years after the press conference that changed their lives, Claire and Aaron were sitting on the porch of their home, watching the sunset over New York. Claire was 7 months pregnant with their first daughter, a daughter they had already decided to name Claire, in honor of the mother that Claire never had the chance to properly know. "Do you ever think about what kind of world we'll be leaving for her?" asked Claire, placing her hand on her belly. "Every day," replied Aaron, covering her hand with his. "But I also think about the kind of parents we'll be. Parents who teach by example that the truth is always better than a lie, even when it's harder. Parents who show that people can change, grow, and choose to be better than they were in the past. And that true love can survive anything," added Claire, "when it's based on honesty and mutual respect." That night, as they prepared for bed, Claire looked at the photograph of her mother that now occupied a place of honor in their bedroom. Finally, after decades, she felt that she had honored Claire Mitchell Sr.'s memory. She had found the truth about what had happened to her, had ensured justice for her and other victims, and had built a life based on the values that her mother would have approved of. Most importantly, she had found a love that was everything her mother would have wished for her, a love based on truth, respect, and a true partnership between equals. When Aaron embraced her that night, Claire knew that they had created something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of a complicated beginning. They had proved that people can change, that love can triumph over betrayal when there is genuine commitment to growth and honesty, and that sometimes the most valuable things in life come from the most unexpected places. Together, they had found not just love, but redemption, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that their lives made a difference in the world. It was more than either of them had dreamed when they first met in that dusty archive room, and it was exactly the kind of ending that both deserved after everything they had faced together.